Did you know that there was a Stoic who was the father of Zeno of Tarsus? That's right. In today's episode, we are looking at the life and legacy of Dioscorides, the father of Zeno of Tarsus. You see, he was a pupil of Chrysippus. He was also the grandfather of Cleanthes, and he is not to be confused with the other Dioscorides who wrote a medical text. We are going to look at this lesser-known Dioscorides today because although he isn't mentioned often in the extant literature, he is an important figure in the early development of Stoicism. Let's get started. So little is known about Dioscorides' life, but Diogenes Laertius does tell us some things about him. And I just want to start by saying that Diogenes' work is often unreliable, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. The first thing Diogenes tells us is that Dioscorides was the father of Zeno of Tarsus, but that Zeno's mother, after his death, remarried and then had another son named Milon. Now, according to Diogenes, Milon would become the head of the Stoicoical, which means that Zeno's younger half-brother would take over the leadership role in the school after Zeno's death. This doesn't sit quite right with me because when we look at the sources for Zeno's life, it seems clear that his half-brother never took over the Stoicoical. So I am thinking either Diogenes has his timeline wrong, or he has conflated two different half-brothers of Zeno into one person. But what do I know? I'm just a lowly YouTuber. But anyways, Diogenes also tells us that Dioscorides was a pupil of Chrysippus, which means that Zeno was technically Chrysippus' student too. And he gives us this interesting little tidbit about Dioscorides. He says that Dioscorides used to make fun of Chrysippus because he was short and fat. So apparently he wasn't very nice. But Diogenes tells us that Dioscorides died before Zeno's mother remarried, so he must have died sometime before 230 BC, but again, that's just Diogenes telling the story. It may not be accurate. The only other source we have for Dioscorides is this papyrus from Egypt that contains a letter from the elder Cato to his son about avoiding people like Dioscorides. Now, this letter was written sometime between 204 and 189 BC, so it's well after Dioscorides' death. But Cato uses Dioscorides as an example of the types of people that his son should avoid. And he specifically calls out Dioscorides for being a parasite, someone who freeloads off of others and does no work. And he accuses Dioscorides of flattering everyone and telling harmful jokes. And this really paints a picture of someone who was disliked. But again, keep in mind that this is coming from Cato, someone who was extremely conservative and old-fashioned, so I wouldn't necessarily trust his judgment here. It is possible that Dioscorides was actually just a charismatic and free-spirited person who went against the grain, but Cato couldn't understand that, and thus he painted him as a harmful person. Anyways, despite the fact that our sources are limited, I still think it is important to talk about Dioscorides, because we have to remember that Zeno didn't just pop out of nowhere. He came from somewhere and was influenced by a number of people in his youth. And although we don't know much about Dioscorides, we can learn something about Zeno by piecing together the scant evidence for his father. So let's talk about what we can learn. First of all, since Dioscorides was a pupil of Chrysippus, it's safe to say that he was a Stoic philosopher. And if he was a Stoic, it's likely that he was trying to pass on the teachings of Stoicism to his son Zeno. Remember that in ancient philosophy, teaching was a way of life. It wasn't just something you did on the side or to pay the bills. Teaching was the main thing these philosophers did, and if we look at the Stoics after Zeno, we see many of them traveling around the Mediterranean and teaching their philosophy wherever they go. So it makes sense that Dioscorides was doing the same thing. And it makes sense that Zeno would hear him teaching and then eventually be taught by him. This leads me to my next point, which is that Dioscorides probably ran a school of his own. Again, this is just speculation on my part. But it makes sense that a Stoic philosopher would have his own school, where he could teach students and share his wisdom. And once again, when we look at the other Stoics, we see that most of them end up running schools. So it seems likely that Dioscorides did the same. And since Zeno was his son, it would have been natural for Zeno to attend his school and learn from him. Finally, I want to talk about the nature of the relationship between Dioscorides and Zeno. Since Dioscorides died before Zeno became famous, it's likely that Zeno looked up to him and wanted to make him proud. And when we read through Zeno's works, we can see that he was very concerned with living a good life and following the path of virtue. And I can't help but wonder if this was partially because he wanted to make his father proud. Of course, this is just speculation on my part, but it's an interesting idea to consider. And so that's all I have to say about Dioscorides. It is amazing how even the smallest details of these ancient philosophers' lives can reveal so much about them and their philosophy. And as we continue to study Stoicism, I hope that you will never stop being amazed by the power of this philosophy. Now I want to turn it over to you. What did you think of today's episode? Did you find it helpful? Did you learn anything new? And do you have any ideas for future episodes? Leave your answers in the comments below. Also, if you haven't already subscribed, please do. It's free and it helps us grow. Thanks for watching, and remember to be good to one another.